This is the new 2024 Mercedes-AMG GLC 43, and it's the high-performance version of Mercedes' smaller GLC crossover. It has almost 420 horsepower, and it does 0 to 60 in under 5 seconds, but it has a relatively reasonable starting price of around $66,000. Today, I'm going to review the AMG GLC 43 and show you all of its quirks and features. Today's video is sponsored by Cars and Bids, which is my online car auction website for modern enthusiast cars. So far, Cars and Bids has sold almost $500 million worth of cars, all sorts of special interesting stuff like this, and this, and this, and this. So, if you're looking to buy or sell a cool enthusiast car, do it at carsandbids.com. All right, time for the quirks and features of the new AMG GLC 43, and undoubtedly the biggest quirk is the powertrain. So, a regular GLC 300, normal car that a regular person would buy, has a 2-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder engine with 255 horsepower. This has a 2-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder engine with 416 horsepower. That is a massive amount of power to get from a turbo 4-cylinder. It sends this from 0 to 60 in about 4.7 seconds, which is a pretty strong time, especially for the lesser AMG model compared to the 63. And really, it is a big power number. Wasn't that long ago you had to go to a V8 for 416 horsepower? Now it's right here in a turbo 4-cylinder. And of course, in this engine bay, you can see the universal symbol for 4 cylinders, which is 4 plastic things on top of the plastic engine cover. Right there, they have no bearing on the actual mechanics of the vehicle, but there's 4 of them because it's 4 cylinders. They all do that, who knows why. You might be wondering, how does a 416 horsepower turbo 4-cylinder sound? Take a listen through this car's quad pipes. Now, amazingly, the new AMG GLC 63, the top-of-the-line top dog, also uses this engine, but then adds an electric motor on top of it for 670-watt horsepower. An absolutely ridiculous figure, but that's what the 63 models put it out. 670 horsepower and 0 to 60 in the 2-point-something second range. A crazy figure for the high-performance version of Mercedes' compact crossover. And to me, that kind of puts the GLC 63 on sort of the next level of insane. With that much power, it's just crazy. There's always been a lot of talk of whether the GLC 43 is a real AMG car, not the top-line 63, sort of the watered-down version. But now that the 63 has so much power and speed, this is sort of a reasonable high-performance alternative in my mind. It's still really fast, but it's not 670 horsepower, which obviously seems a little like overkill, and that's also reflected in the pricing. The 63 pricing hasn't yet been released, but probably starts around $100,000, which is big money for any Mercedes GLC. This one is plenty fast, plenty powerful, and starting price is $66,000, which is actually fairly reasonable given the level of performance and luxury that you get, as I'll show you. And Mercedes-Benz seems to agree that this is becoming sort of the reasonable, rational AMG car, bought by reasonable, rational humans. They're starting to really play up the AMG-ness of the GLC 43. You can see the front badge has been replaced, not with a 3-pointed star, but with this special AMG badge that adds a little AMG credibility and well, AMG-ness to the car. The key also is interesting. In the past, Mercedes AMG keys have been the same as regular Mercedes-Benz models. No longer. It says AMG on the back, as you can see, and when you flip it over, the lock button also says AMG on it, and they get AMG on the key twice. That's how AMG it is. Actually, I make fun of them for that, but the rest of this car is fairly subtle. And in that way, it sort of feels like the traditional AMG models from years past. You don't have excessive branding all throughout the car. It just says AMG in the back. You have this little turbo badge on the side, quad pipes, and that's about it. It's a fairly subtle car, particularly compared to the 63 AMG models that often now have extra vents and scoops and big wheels and red accents and all sorts of other stuff that really distinguish them. This is still really fast, but surprisingly subtle, and to me, that kind of feels like AMG from the late 90s, early mid-2000s, when the cars had big power, but you didn't necessarily know what they were. Now, interestingly, although the exterior is pretty subtle, when you open the door to get inside, that's where the AMG really hits you. You got AMG on the door sill, and it lights up. The floor mat, AMG, as you can see. The seat back has an AMG badge, and the base of the steering wheel reminds you of AMG. So there's some AMG touches visible right away, and it's not just that stuff. You also get these sport seats, which are tighter and grippier than what you have in the regular GLC, with Alcantara and extra bolstering to keep you in place on the racetrack. Plus, you get red stitching in this car and red seat belts to emphasize its sportiness. But there's some cool stuff in here that goes beyond just the cosmetics, and one of my favorite AMG touches is on the steering wheel. You have this little dial kind of sticking off the steering wheel on the right. That's your drive mode dial, and it's actually a screen. As you change drive modes, the display changes color and shows you the new drive mode right there on the steering wheel, which is kind of a neat touch. And over on the other side, same deal. You have a pair of buttons and a screen, and you can use the bottom button to turn on and off traction control. You might need to do in your AMG, and the upper button pulls up the AMG menu in the center infotainment screen, where you can see your instant horsepower and torque being used, among other high performance items. And from here, you can also switch to see various other real-time car displays in this center screen, like for instance, your fuel consumption, as you can see, or another screen shows your current steering angle, suspension travel, that sort of thing, all displayed on your in-car information readout. And since we're already talking about the center screen, let's talk about the center screen. There is a lot to love about the Mercedes-Benz infotainment system. It is absolutely fantastic. I love the home screen here, which basically displays a map as your home item, but then a bunch of little icons within the map that you can use to quickly go to various different things, like the radio, the phone, all sorts of different spots throughout the infotainment system. And if you can't figure out what the icon is supposed to be, you just tap the home button again, and it pulls up all the icons with descriptions to make it really easy to figure out exactly where you're trying to get in this screen. It is excellent. There's also a bunch of other cool stuff in here. For instance, a fingerprint reader. This little black square below the screen, you put your fingerprint on there and you can sync it up to your favorites, so that every time you get in the car, you just put in your finger and you got all of your favorite selections. I also love the responsiveness of this screen. Tremendously quick to respond, just like a smartphone, to basically any input, and it's very intuitive, as I showed you before. Very easy to figure out exactly where everything is, really among the smartest user interface designs in the entire car industry. The screen also has a really excellent camera system with high quality cameras that show many different angles, including this 3D angle sort of floating outside the car, so you can easily see, like within a parking spot or a curb, exactly where the car is placed, which makes it a lot easier to park or maneuver the car in tight spaces. Now, the one potential pitfall of the screen is that it does incorporate your climate controls into the screen, but the climate controls always take the same position. So it doesn't matter what screen you're on, they'll always be right there. They're essentially fixed in place. It's not as easy to figure out and press as a button, but you never have to worry about them disappearing or going somewhere else. They're always right where you think they're going to be to adjust all of your climate control functions. And like in other Mercedes-Benz models, your heated seats are still a traditional button over on the door. Press it to turn it on. You also have your seat memory and your seat controls over there. That stuff hasn't migrated into the screen. Still physical buttons, which is nice, even though the climate controls have. Relatively easy to use. Now, the other big screen in this car is the gauge cluster screen, which is also fantastic. Mercedes-Benz has been refining this gauge cluster screen for the last several model years, and I think they finally got it almost exactly right. You can choose between a wide variety of different screen displays, including this crazy hyper sport display for ultimate high performance, or a full screen map if you want to see where you're going, or a more traditional classic screen with information in the center, like a trip odometer or the music you're listening to, or a smaller map in the center of the classic display. You really can have it show you basically anything you want to see, which is absolutely fantastic. The only drawback to this whole screen control situation is that Mercedes-Benz still has not integrated a next track button into its steering wheel. Every other car, you can tap a button and move on to the next track, the media that you're listening to. Not here. In order to go to the next track here, you got to tap this in the screen if you're on that menu, or have the music track up in your gauge cluster screen, and then you can go next track, previous track, but that prevents you from displaying anything other than the music track in the center, which is a shame. That is still an annoying drawback. Mercedes still hasn't done it, but everything else in this whole infotainment situation is really excellent. Now, otherwise, beyond all the screen stuff, the rest of the controls in this interior are mostly straightforward, with a few quirky exceptions. The most obvious is the sunroof control, which is a finger slider. You can see the little slidey pad here, and to open up the sunshade, you slide your finger back and then it opens. And while it's opening, you can tap at any point and it will stop, and then slide your finger forward and then the sunshade will start going back in the other direction. And you can just keep sliding forward, backward, etc. And the sunroof works the same way. Once you have the sunshade completely open, then your little slider controls the sunroof. And once again, you can slide your finger back and the sunroof will open until you tap to stop, and then it stops. Slide your finger back in the other direction, the sunroof closes, and you can play with that all day. It's definitely an interesting operation compared to a traditional button or switch. Now, speaking of different than a traditional button or switch, I'm not in love with the volume control in this car. It's this little slider right here over on the passenger side. They put it on the passenger side because the driver has their own volume slider on the steering wheel. Neither of them works perfectly. A volume dial is a better way to get precise volume changes. The sliders are prone to going too high or too low, reacting too fast or too slowly on the steering wheel and in the center, and I wish they just gave you a traditional slider. With that said, one thing I do like in these center buttons below the screen, this one pulls up your camera system, and you press that button and all of the cameras appear and you can quickly change angles. It's nice to get such easy and quick access to your cameras in case you need them because you're in a tight space but you haven't shifted into reverse when they automatically come on. Well, you just tap that button and then they're on and you can easily access your cameras. Very good to have such easy access. Also, one other interesting control in this car, the seat controls on the door adjust the seat position, obviously, and also the headrest. You move this top part and the headrest goes up or down. But the GLC also lets you move the headrest forward or back. You press this little button on the side of the headrest. Most people probably don't know it's there, and then you can move the headrest forward or backward in addition to up or down, which only adds to your comfort and convenience. Pretty cool to have that little hidden adjustment. And next up, we move on to the back seat in the GLC, which is actually surprisingly large. For a compact crossover, I get decent space back here. My knee is pushing up against the front seat, but the seat is positioned where I would put it as a pretty tall driver, and I do have about an inch of space between my knee and the seat, plus good headroom and good hip room. It's more space than you'd expect from a compact crossover. However, with each new GLC, it's getting a little bigger, especially because Mercedes now has the GLA and the GLB as even more compact crossovers, kind of positioning the GLC to get larger and grow into the mid-size segment, which it seems to be given the interior room back here. Now, Also worth pointing out in back, you do get some of the sporty touches from the front, like the Alcantara seat centers, as you can see, keeps you in place on the racetrack. The red stitching is also carried over, as you can see, and the red seat belts as well, adding that sporty feel even in back. Other items worth pointing out back here, the climate vents are a big win. You don't always get them in vehicles in this segment. However, a big loss is no power ports back here. I don't remember the last time I was in a car this expensive without any rear seat charge ports for rear passenger devices. That's a big loss. I'm sure it's optional, but frankly, it really shouldn't be. The other interesting thing back here is the rear armrest. You put it down, and of course, you have a nice, comfortable armrest, but there's a little panel in the front part. You push it once, and a little slot appears. That's apparently for your smartphone. You would stick it in there and then just sort of display it. You push it a second time, and then cup holders appear, and that's apparently for your cups. You can drink from them. And finally, we move on to the cargo area in the GLC 43. Open up the tailgate. You see, the cargo area has a lot to like. It's good size, decent space for all of your cargo needs, especially for a vehicle in this segment. And it has a little storage area behind this net for smaller items so they don't roll around. And it has this little strap over on the side for smaller valuable items so they firmly stay put. You can also lift up the floor of the cargo area to reveal a surprisingly large surface underneath where you can store even more smaller stuff if you don't want it rolling around with the big dogs in back. And you have switches on the sides of the cargo area to drop the rear seats. Pull this switch and the seat goes down. It's not power operated, so the seat can't go back up from here, but you can get it to go down, which is nice and convenient if you're trying to load in some giant item in back and you just need those seats to go down. Overall, a pretty strong cargo area. So you get some good practicality from the GLC 43, but I'm especially interested in how this very powerful turbo four-cylinder drives. Let's find out. All right, driving the new GLC 43. Now, I don't think I have yet reviewed a 43 AMG car on my channel, even though they've kind of swept the Mercedes performance world by storm over the last 5 or 6 years. The 63 cars have gotten sort of very expensive, very powerful, sort of into kind of the next level territory, and these 43 cars have become very popular for people who sort of want to have some fun and enjoy an AMG car without spending the crazy money for a 63 and getting all the other stuff that goes along with all that, the big wheels and the expensive, insurance costs, et cetera, et cetera. This is sort of like a reasonable option. And this car has become, right now, an even more reasonable option because the new AMG GLC 63 is now so powerful, so expensive, and this one is bumped up in power. But it has this controversial powertrain, this turbocharged four-cylinder, and you're thinking, how could a turbo four-cylinder really be what we're looking for in this car? But I have to say, driving this around, it's pretty impressive. Mercedes has done a really impressive job, first with its turbo V6s of trying to replicate V8s, and now with its turbo four-cylinder of trying to replicate like a really good high-performance engine with more cylinders. It really is something. You put your foot down, and the only real lag you have is actually from the transmission trying to find the right gear, because it's like a 47 speed for fuel economy, whatever it is. So once it does that, there's no turbo lag. It keeps you in the right power band, particularly if you're in sport mode. It's quite ready to accelerate. It's got a very potent charge to it. I don't want to say it feels like a V8, but it doesn't really feel that far off. Like I'm flooring it little delay, but again, a lot of that is transmission shifting. And then you floor it and it's got good power. It sticks you at redline for a while. I'm here in sport mode, and it just feels like it has big, smooth power like you would associate with a big turbo V6 or even a V8, even though this is just a turbo four-cylinder. You lose a lot of things. You lose the sound, of course, and I think they've tried to improve the sound, but any improvements they've tried to make have not been successful. I will say, getting behind the wheel and actually driving it makes me feel better about the whole giant turbo four-cylinder thing. You still wonder about long-term reliability with an engine that's this stressed. And frankly, I do think it doesn't really belong in the 63 cars. Those cars are just so special, and to get a turbo four-cylinder, it just doesn't seem right. But in the 43 cars like this one, it maybe seems like it makes a little bit more sense. One thing I've never loved about the 43 AMG cars is the ride quality is pretty harsh. And that does in fact remain the case in this situation. This car's ride quality is pretty harsh, considering it's sort of like the baby AMG. And I wouldn't be surprised if that actually puts off some buyers. Some people who are thinking to themselves, oh, I want a performance-y, Mercedes-AMG car. Well, then they drive this thing and it's like, that's rougher than I was expecting. And it definitely does feel surprisingly harsh for not the top-of-the-line high-performance car. It's also worth pointing out that this car, the whole driving experience, is quite smooth. It's really not so bad, despite the fact that you have this 4-cylinder that you got to wring out to get power out of. It feels smooth at basically all speeds, and frankly, it feels pretty torquey even at 2,000 RPM with a little bit of throttle. And I think that's where a lot of the turbo 4-cylinders start to lose their appeal, is when you kind of add a little throttle and it's not sure if you want a lot or a little. The CLA 45 had this problem, where you'd put in a little throttle and it would kind of be not a great response, and then it would give you too much. And this is a lot more linear and a lot better. I think it has a really, really smooth powertrain operation. This is based on the GLC, which is a very, very common, globally popular compact crossover. And so it's like just a generally well-designed, well-engineered car. It's because it's going to find a massive global audience. And so generally speaking, the regular automotive operations of this car is pretty good. Frankly, I generally only have positive things to say, which I'm surprised about. I haven't yet driven the new turbo 4-cylinder 63 models. I'm curious to see how I feel about that. But again, for a 43, it seems like maybe an okay choice, and I don't think you really lose all that much. And frankly, you gain more power, better acceleration, probably better fuel economy, and it's still a smooth powertrain. Just a little bit of a harsh ride, and you lose the noise. Those are kind of some of the drawbacks. But otherwise, there's a lot to like about this car, especially for the price point, as the 63 has now gotten really big money, particularly for a GLC. And so that's the new Mercedes-AMG GLC 43. This isn't the fastest Mercedes-AMG SUV, but it's pretty potent. And if you don't need the GLC 63's 670 horsepower, this is a more reasonable alternative with a more reasonable price tag. And now it's time to give the new GLC 43 a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 60 out of 100, which puts the GLC 43 here against rivals. It shoots to the top of the list, which makes sense as it offers a nice combination of performance, technology, luxury, and fairly acceptable pricing. And it's only beaten out by the Porsche Macan and BMW X3M, which makes sense as those cars are more exciting but also more expensive. The GLC 43 is a nice all-rounder with a lot to offer, and it's a strong entry in the luxury performance SUV space.